white woman caught hitting and denying black baby at daycare. Imagine this. A loving mother, Whitney, steps into her baby's daycare a little earlier than usual, ready to surprise her daughter, Lara. She's expecting to see her little girl playing happily, maybe sharing toys with her friends. But what she walks into is something no parent should ever have to witness. Her heart stops as she sees a daycare worker, a woman she trusted with Lara's care, raising her hand to hit the tiny, defenseless child. Lara flinches, her wide, innocent eyes filled with confusion and fear. The worker sneers, dismissing her cries as if they were an inconvenience. Whitney freezes, her stomach churning with disbelief and anger. Could this really be happening? Her beautiful baby girl, treated like she didn't matter, like she wasn't worthy of kindness or love. And it wasn't just the physical act, it was the look on the worker's face, that cold, dismissive expression that seemed to scream, "She's not worth it." This isn't just a story about a mother's worst nightmare. It's about something deeper, something that's been lurking in the shadows for far too long. It's about the kind of racism that doesn't just target adults, but reaches into the lives of children, robbing them of their innocence before they even understand the world. Whitney and her husband, Chris, knew this couldn't go unnoticed. They knew Lara's voice, and the voices of countless other children deserved to be heard. What happened next will make your blood boil, but it will also inspire you. Because this isn't just their fight, it's all of ours. A fight against systemic racism, against people who believe they can harm others and walk away without consequence. A fight for Lara, and for every child who deserves to be seen, valued, and protected. Whitney and Chris had always dreamed of creating a life filled with love, stability, and opportunity. As a young black couple, their journey was far from easy. Both grew up facing systemic challenges that seemed insurmountable at times. Whitney, with her sharp mind and unrelenting drive, navigated an underfunded school system, often hearing teachers subtly imply she wasn't meant to achieve more than her circumstances. Chris, on the other hand, faced constant stereotyping, always seen as a troublemaker before he even opened his mouth. But through it all, they refused to let the world define their worth. When they met in college, it felt like destiny. Both were drawn to each other's strength and shared determination to build something greater than what they'd known. They worked tirelessly, balancing multiple jobs while studying late into the night, their dreams always at the forefront. After graduation, Whitney secured a position as a project manager at a tech firm, while Chris launched his own graphic design business. Together, they defied the odds, proving that perseverance could overcome even the most formidable barriers. Their greatest joy, however, came with the birth of their daughter, Lara. From the moment they held her, Whitney and Chris knew they would do whatever it took to protect her from the struggles they had endured. Lara was their light, her laughter filling their home with warmth and hope. Every milestone, her first smile, her first steps, her first words, felt like a triumph, a reminder of the beautiful future they were building. When it came time to choose a daycare, Whitney and Chris were meticulous. They researched extensively, visited multiple centers, and asked countless questions. They finally chose one that seemed perfect, modern, clean, and staffed with professionals who spoke passionately about early childhood development. It wasn't cheap, but they didn't care. Lara deserved the best, and they were willing to make sacrifices to ensure she got it. At first, everything seemed fine. Lara adjusted well, and the staff reassured Whitney and Chris that their daughter was thriving. But slowly, subtle signs began to appear. Whitney noticed that Lara would cling to her more tightly in the mornings, her tiny arms refusing to let go as she was handed over to the staff. "She's just adjusting," they told her. It's normal for her age. Whitney tried to believe them, brushing off her unease as overprotectiveness. But as the weeks went on, Lara's behavior changed in ways that Whitney and Chris couldn't ignore. She became unusually quiet, her once bubbly personality dimming. Bedtime turned into a struggle, with Lara waking up crying in the middle of the night, reaching for her parents as if she were afraid of being left alone. Whitney's heart ached, but whenever she brought up her concerns, the daycare staff would dismiss them. "Kids go through phases," they said with a smile that felt rehearsed, as though they'd said it 100 times before. Then there were the bruises, small marks on Lara's arms that Whitney noticed during bath time. "She probably bumped into something," Chris offered, trying to soothe his wife's growing anxiety. But Whitney couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her instincts, honed through years of fighting for herself in a world that often dismissed her, were screaming that her daughter was in danger. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Whitney started paying closer attention. She spoke to other parents, casually at first, trying to gauge if anyone else had noticed anything unusual. Some seemed hesitant to talk, their eyes darting nervously as they dismissed her questions with vague answers. Others opened up, sharing small incidents that, on their own, didn't seem like much, but collectively painted a troubling picture. It all came to a head one afternoon when Whitney decided to pick Lara up early. She walked into the daycare expecting to see her daughter playing or napping. Instead, she heard a muffled cry from the corner of the room. As she turned, her blood ran cold. There was Lara, sitting on the floor, her tear-streaked face turned up toward a staff member who was glaring down at her. Before Whitney could react, she saw the woman raise her hand and swat Lara's tiny arm. The force wasn't enough to leave a lasting injury, but the intent was unmistakable. Whitney felt like the air had been knocked out of her. How could someone do this to a child, her child? The staff member, noticing Whitney, quickly straightened up, her face shifting into a practiced smile. "Oh, Lara's just having a bit of a moment," she said, as if nothing had happened. But Whitney had seen it, and the image was burned into her mind. Grabbing Lara, Whitney confronted the woman, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. The woman denied everything, her tone dripping with condescension. "You must have misunderstood," she said. "Kids are sensitive, you know how it is." But Whitney wasn't having it. She knew what she'd seen, and no amount of gaslighting was going to change that. When she got home, she broke down, holding Lara tightly as Chris tried to console her. "We trusted them," she sobbed. "We trusted them with our baby, and this is what they did." Chris, furious and protective, vowed that they wouldn't let this go. They would find out the truth, and they would make sure no other family ever had to experience this kind of betrayal. The pain Whitney and Chris felt was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to their resolve. They had fought their whole lives to overcome the barriers placed in front of them, and now they would fight for Lara. This wasn't just about one daycare or one worker. This was about ensuring their daughter, and every child like her, was treated with the respect and care they deserved. Whitney and Chris couldn't sleep that night. The images of what Whitney had witnessed at the daycare played on a loop in her mind, each replay tightening the knot in her chest. Chris sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder as they tried to make sense of it all. "How could someone do this?" Whitney whispered, her voice cracking. "How could they treat her like she's nothing?" Chris didn't have an answer, but his jaw clenched with a silent resolve. The next morning, the couple knew they couldn't stay silent. Whitney called the daycare to demand an immediate meeting with the management. Chris took the day off work, unwilling to let Whitney face this alone. They walked into the daycare's brightly colored lobby, hand in hand, their faces a mix of determination and simmering anger. Everything about the place now felt wrong. The cheerful murals on the walls, the welcoming smell of freshly cleaned floors. It all seemed like a facade hiding something much darker. The daycare manager, a middle-aged woman with a polished demeanor, greeted them with a forced smile. "We've always appreciated your trust in us," she began, her tone dripping with insincerity. Whitney cut her off, her voice shaking. "Don't you dare talk to me about trust. I saw what happened yesterday. I saw what that woman did to my daughter." The manager's expression didn't change, but Whitney noticed a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it fear or just annoyance? "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the manager said smoothly. "Our staff are highly trained, and I'm sure what you saw was taken out of context." Taken out of context? Chris's voice was louder now, his anger bubbling to the surface. "My wife saw one of your workers hit our daughter. What context justifies that?" The manager sighed as if she were being inconvenienced by the confrontation. "We understand your concern, but children can be difficult at times. Our staff are trained to handle them appropriately." Appropriately? Whitney's voice broke, tears forming in her eyes. "Is hitting a defenseless child what you call appropriate? My daughter is barely 2 years old. She's innocent, trusting, and you let someone hurt her." Her voice was raw, filled with a mixture of pain and fury. The manager straightened her posture, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I'll speak with the staff member in question and review the situation, but I have to remind you that these accusations are serious, and without concrete evidence, it's difficult for us to act." Whitney stared at her in disbelief. "Concrete evidence? My word isn't enough. Do you think I'd make this up?" Chris stepped forward, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. "You've got cameras in this place, don't you? Check the footage." The manager hesitated, her polished facade cracking ever so slightly. "We do have cameras, but they're primarily for internal use and—" "And what?" Chris snapped. "You won't check them, or you won't show us because you know what we'll see?" There was a tense silence, the air thick with unspoken truths. The manager finally said, "I'll look into this and get back to you." It was a dismissal, thinly veiled as reassurance. As they left the office, Whitney felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. "They don't care, Chris," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to protect her, not Lara." Chris squeezed her hand tightly. "Then we'll protect her. If they won't give us answers, we'll get them ourselves." The couple spent the next few days gathering every piece of information they could. Whitney spoke to other parents, carefully framing her questions to avoid raising alarm. Some seemed genuinely surprised, but others shared their own uneasy experiences. One mother mentioned her son coming home with scratches that were never explained. Another recalled seeing a worker speak harshly to a toddler in a way that felt off. Their suspicions were mounting, but nothing could prepare them for what they found when they got their hands on the daycare's surveillance footage. Whitney and Chris had contacted a local lawyer who helped them issue a formal request for the video from the day of the incident. At first, the daycare resisted, citing privacy concerns. But after relentless pressure and the implied threat of legal action, the footage was finally handed over. Watching the video was one of the hardest things Whitney had ever done. She clutched Chris's hand tightly as they sat in their living room, their laptop screen flickering with the grainy footage. At first, it was just a typical daycare scene, children playing, staff moving about. But then, they saw Lara. She was sitting on the floor, her tiny frame hunched over as she played with a block. The worker Whitney had seen came into view, standing over Lara with a look of impatience. Lara dropped the block, and the worker's reaction was immediate. She grabbed Lara's arm roughly, yanking her to her feet. Lara whimpered, her little face scrunched in confusion and fear. And then it happened. The SWAT Whitney had witnessed, followed by the worker pushing Lara back onto the floor as if she were a burden. Whitney gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Chris's face hardened, his eyes locked on the screen. "Pause it," he said, his voice low. Whitney froze the frame on the worker's face, her expression cold and unfeeling. "She looks like she hates her," Whitney whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. How could she look at a baby like that? Chris pulled her into his arms, holding her as she sobbed. "We're going to make this right," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet rage. "They're not getting away with this." The couple knew they had a long road ahead, but one thing was clear. They would fight for Lara, no matter what it took. This wasn't just about their daughter anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about standing up to a system that allowed this kind of behavior to fester. They weren't just fighting for Lara. They were fighting for every child who had ever been made to feel small, unworthy, or unseen. And they wouldn't stop until justice was served. The daycare's blatant denial left Whitney and Chris feeling crushed, but far from defeated. They weren't the type of people to let injustice slide, especially not when it came to their baby girl. That night, after tucking Lara into bed and kissing her softly on the forehead, Whitney sat at the kitchen table with Chris. The daycare's lies, the workers' cruelty, and Lara's frightened face played in her mind like a never-ending loop. "I just don't understand," Whitney said softly, tears welling in her eyes. "How can someone look at a child, an innocent child, and treat them like they're nothing?" Chris reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Evil doesn't need a reason, Whitney," he said, his voice steady but somber. "But the Bible says, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. Lara's growing up in love, with God's guidance. That's why she'll overcome this. We'll overcome this." Whitney nodded, though the tears still fell. She found strength in Chris's words, a reminder that even in their darkest moments, they weren't walking this road alone. Their faith, tested so many times in their lives, felt like a quiet but steady flame. And now they had a responsibility, not just to Lara, but to the truth. The next morning, Whitney and Chris began their fight in earnest. Whitney called the police to report the abuse, recounting everything she had seen and handing over the daycare footage as evidence. The officer on the other end listened carefully, but Whitney could hear the skepticism in his tone. "We'll look into it," he said, his voice clipped. She hung up the phone and slammed it down on the counter, her frustration boiling over. "Look into it?" she fumed. "Why does it always feel like no one takes us seriously until we scream and shout?" Chris, standing by the window with Lara in his arms, turned to her. "Then we'll scream and shout," he said. "We'll make them listen." Whitney took to social media, posting an emotional video recounting the incident and sharing snippets of the surveillance footage. Her voice cracked as she spoke, holding back tears, but staying resolute. "This isn't just about my daughter," she said. "It's about every child who's been ignored, every parent who's been gaslighted into silence. This is about standing up and saying, enough." The post quickly gained traction, shared by friends, family, and even strangers who were moved by her story. The comments section filled with messages of support, outrage, and shared experiences. "I've been through this too," one mother wrote. "Stay strong, we're with you." Others offered to help in any way they could, from legal advice to organizing local protests. Within days, the story had spread beyond their community, drawing attention from local news outlets. Whitney and Chris were interviewed, their faces a mix of anger and determination as they recounted the events. "We trusted them," Whitney said during one segment, her voice shaking. "We put our faith in people who promised to care for our daughter, and they broke that trust. But we're not going to stop until justice is served. As the story gained traction, the daycare came under immense pressure. Other parents began stepping forward, sharing their own uneasy experiences. One father admitted he had seen the same worker grab his son roughly by the arm, but hadn't spoken up, dismissing it as a one-time incident. Another mother revealed that her daughter often came home crying, saying the staff weren't nice. The community was outraged. Protests were organized outside the daycare with signs reading, "Protect our kids" and "Accountability now." Whitney and Chris attended every rally, standing shoulder to shoulder with other parents, some of whom they'd never even met before. Whitney spoke at one of the gatherings, her voice raw but filled with resolve. "This isn't just about one daycare or one worker," she said. "This is about a system that lets things like this happen over and over again. It's about saying, no more." But while the community rallied behind them, the legal battle was just beginning. The daycare's lawyers fought back, attempting to downplay the incident and discredit Whitney's claims. "They're exaggerating," one statement read. "Our staff are trained professionals who always act in the best interest of the children." Whitney and Chris were furious, but they refused to back down. They filed a formal lawsuit against the daycare, citing negligence, emotional distress, and failure to protect the children in their care. Their lawyer, a passionate advocate for child safety, vowed to expose every corner of the daycare's operations. "If there's rot in this system," he said, "we're going to root it out." The daycare's denials and deflections only fueled the community's anger. Whitney and Chris's story had struck a chord with people far beyond their town. Parents from across the country began sharing their own stories of neglect, racism, and abuse in childcare settings. "This happened to us too," one mother wrote in a heartfelt email to Whitney. "You're not just fighting for Lara, you're fighting for all of our kids." For Whitney and Chris, the support was overwhelming but also deeply humbling. "I never thought so many people would care," Whitney said one evening as she scrolled through messages of encouragement. It's like God is using this to bring people together, to make something good out of something so awful." Chris nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Maybe that's why we went through this," he said quietly. "Maybe it's not just about Lara, it's about all the kids who've been hurt and ignored. Maybe this is our purpose." And so the couple pressed on, bolstered by their faith and the growing community around them. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew they weren't walking it alone. With every protest, every news story, and every supportive message, they felt the weight of something bigger, a movement, a calling, a fight for justice that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't just about seeking accountability for the daycare worker or fixing one broken system. It was about standing up for what was right, about shining a light into the darkness, and about ensuring that no child, black, white, or otherwise, would ever feel invisible again. Whitney and Chris knew this fight wasn't just for Lara. It was for every child and every parent who had ever felt helpless, and they wouldn't stop until their voices were heard. As the courtroom buzzed with murmurs after the verdict was read, Whitney sat motionless, letting the reality sink in. For months, every waking moment had been consumed by this fight, for justice, for Lara, for every family that had been ignored or silenced. She thought about the nights she spent crying, doubting, and wondering if their efforts would even make a difference. Now, hearing the ruling and feeling the energy of the crowd outside, she realized this was more than a victory for her family. It was a beacon of hope for others. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed with people holding signs, chanting in solidarity, and waiting to hear from Whitney and Chris. Many had never met the couple before, but felt a deep connection to their story. As Whitney stepped up to the podium, Lara resting on her hip, the crowd fell silent. Chris stood beside her, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. Whitney began speaking, her voice trembling but strong. "There were moments when I thought I couldn't do this," she said, her eyes scanning the sea of faces before her. "When I thought the system would win, that they'd silence us like they've silenced so many before. But every time I felt that fear, I thought of Lara. I thought about how her little voice had no way of defending itself, and I realized that it was my job to speak for her, for all the children who can't speak for themselves." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Whitney raised her hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about my daughter," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "This is about every parent who's ever felt powerless. Every family who's been brushed aside or told they were imagining things. Today, we showed them that we won't be silenced, that our children matter, that we all matter." Chris stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "We've been told our whole lives that the system isn't built for people like us, that we're supposed to accept injustice and move on. But today, we proved that's a lie. Today, we proved that when we stand together, when we refuse to back down, we can move mountains." The applause was deafening. Whitney and Chris could see the tears in people's eyes, feel the hope radiating from the crowd. It was a moment of unity and shared purpose, one that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. After the rally, the messages of support kept pouring in. Emails, social media posts, even handwritten letters from people across the country. One letter from an older woman stood out to Whitney. It read, "I've lived a long life and I've seen a lot of injustice. But seeing you and your husband fight for your daughter has given me hope that the future will be different, that the next generation won't have to endure what we did. Thank you for your courage. You've reminded all of us that our voices matter." Whitney folded the letter carefully, placing it in a keepsake box alongside Lara's first drawing and a photo of the family. She wanted Lara to grow up knowing the impact of her story, not just the pain, but the power it inspired. In the weeks following the trial, Whitney and Chris realized their fight wasn't over. The daycare's reforms were a step in the right direction, but there were still countless other facilities operating without accountability. They decided to channel their newfound platform into something greater. Whitney began meeting with local lawmakers, pushing for legislation that would require stricter oversight of daycares and harsher penalties for negligence and abuse. Chris used his graphic design skills to create a campaign called Protect Our Kids, which aimed to educate parents about their rights and how to spot warning signs of neglect or abuse in childcare settings. Their story continued to inspire others. Parents began sharing their own stories online using the hashtag #BringJusticeForLara, creating a digital movement that brought attention to the often overlooked issue of racism and neglect in early childhood care. The hashtag trended for weeks, sparking nationwide conversations about the intersections of race, class, and child safety. Media outlets invited Whitney and Chris to speak, their interviews often going viral as they shared their journey with raw honesty and unshakable resolve. One day, Whitney received a call from a young mother in another state who had seen her story online. The woman, her voice shaking, explained that she'd pulled her child from a daycare after recognizing the same warning signs Whitney had described. "You saved my baby," the woman said, tears in her voice. "If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." Whitney hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of what they'd achieved. She thought about how powerless she had felt at the beginning of this journey and how far they had come. They hadn't just changed the course of their own lives, they were changing the lives of families across the country. But the work wasn't easy. The couple faced backlash too. Some accused them of overreacting, of making it a racial issue when it didn't need to be. Others sent hateful messages, questioning their motives or accusing them of seeking attention. It hurt, but Whitney and Chris refused to let the negativity deter them. They knew the truth, and they knew they were making a difference. One evening, as they tucked Lara into bed, Whitney looked at Chris and said, "Do you think she'll remember any of this?" Chris smiled softly. "Maybe not the details," he said, "but she'll know what we stood for. She'll know we fought for her, and she'll grow up knowing she's worth fighting for." Whitney nodded, her heart swelling with pride and love. "That's all I want," she said. "For her to know her worth, for her to know that she deserves to be treated with kindness and respect, no matter what." Their journey had started with a moment of heartbreak, but had blossomed into something far greater, a movement, a mission, a legacy. Whitney and Chris knew there was still so much work to be done, but they also knew they weren't alone. They had a community behind them, a growing network of people who believed in their cause and were willing to stand alongside them. As they lay in bed that night, Whitney reflected on how far they had come. From the pain of witnessing Lara's abuse to the joy of seeing real change take root, it had been an emotional roller coaster. But through it all, one thing had remained constant: their love for Lara and their unwavering belief in justice. Their story was far from over, but they knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. Together, they would continue to fight, not just for Lara, but for every child who deserved a brighter, safer future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across their porch, Whitney and Chris sat in quiet reflection, watching Lara chase fireflies in the yard. It was a peaceful moment, a rare break from the whirlwind of the past months. Yet even in this stillness, their minds were filled with purpose. What had begun as a desperate fight for their daughter's safety had blossomed into something far greater, a mission to inspire change, unite communities, and protect every child who deserved a brighter, safer future. Whitney glanced at Chris, her eyes filled with gratitude and determination. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" she asked softly. "That moment when I walked into the daycare. It still feels like a nightmare." Chris reached over, taking her hand in his. "I think about it every day," he admitted. "But I also think about how far we've come. That moment was the start of something bigger than us. It was God's way of calling us to do more, to be more." Whitney nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I used to wonder why it had to happen to us," she said. "Why Lara? Why our family? But now I see. It wasn't just about us. It was about every family out there who's ever felt powerless, every child who's ever been hurt and ignored. God gave us this fight because He knew we could handle it, and because He knew we wouldn't give up." Chris smiled, his grip on her hand tightening. "And we won't," he said firmly. "Not until every parent feels heard. Not until every child is safe. This is just the beginning." Their words weren't just for each other, they were for everyone watching. Whitney and Chris knew that sharing their story wasn't enough. They wanted to connect with others, to create a community where people felt seen, valued, and empowered to make a difference. "Before we end this video," Whitney said, looking directly into the camera, "I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever felt dismissed, silenced, or overlooked because of who you are? Maybe it wasn't about your child. Maybe it was about you. Maybe it was in school, at work, or just walking down the street. We want to hear your story." Chris leaned forward, his voice steady and inviting. "This isn't just about us. This is about all of us. Racism, neglect, injustice, these things thrive in silence. But when we share our experiences, when we speak out, we shine a light on the darkness, and that's how we start to change the world." Whitney continued, her tone earnest and heartfelt. "Drop a comment below or send us a message. We want to hear your voice because your story matters. And when we come together, when we listen to each other and support each other, we create a force that no one can ignore." Chris nodded, his expression serious. "And if you've ever felt alone in your fight, know this: you're not alone anymore. This community is here for you. We see you, we hear you, and we're standing with you." Whitney smiled, her eyes shining with hope. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think, or if you believe in the power of change, please subscribe to our channel. This isn't just a platform, it's a movement. A place where we can come together to fight for justice, celebrate our victories, and lift each other up. Chris added, "And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. We'll keep sharing stories that matter, stories that inspire change and remind us that we're stronger together." Whitney's voice softened, taking on a reflective tone. "We've learned so much on this journey, about ourselves, about our community, and about the power of faith. There were moments when we felt like giving up, when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. But every time, God reminded us that we weren't walking this road alone. He placed people in our path who lifted us up, gave us strength, and reminded us of the power of love and unity." Chris smiled, glancing at Lara, who was now laughing and twirling in the grass. "And it's all for her," he said. "For Lara, and for every child who deserves a future free from fear and full of possibility." Whitney nodded, her voice filled with conviction. "This is our purpose: to fight for what's right, to protect the vulnerable, and to create a world where every child, every person, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." As the video drew to a close, Whitney looked directly into the camera, her expression warm but resolute. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for standing with us. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can build a future we're proud to leave for our children." Chris added, his voice steady and encouraging, "And remember, faith, love, and community can overcome anything. With God's guidance and our shared determination, there's nothing we can't achieve." Whitney and Chris held hands as they smiled at the camera one last time. "We'll see you in the next video," Whitney said. "And until then, stay strong, stay hopeful, and stay united." The screen faded to black, leaving viewers with a simple but powerful message. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Together, we are stronger. The video ended, but the movement continued, fueled by the stories, support, and solidarity of a community determined to create a better world. Whitney and Chris knew their journey was far from over, but they also knew they weren't walking it alone. With every new subscriber, every shared story, and every act of courage, the message grew louder. We are seen, we are heard, and we are unstoppable. Together, we will make a difference.